There is an old unwritten law among those who work the deep sea. They say that when the steel hull breaks and the black water rushes in, the clock doesn't just start ticking, it stops. The ocean is not a place that negotiates, it is a vast, indifferent tomb that seals instantly. For centuries the rule has been absolute. Once a ship settles on the seabed, the souls inside belong to the dark. But on a Sunday morning in 2013 off the coast of Nigeria, the impossible happened. A massive tugboat, the Jascon 4, capsized and sank 100 feet to the bottom of the Atlantic. The oil company wrote off the crew. The families prepared for funerals. The divers were sent down into the freezing silt not to rescue anyone, but simply to recover bodies for the insurance claim. They expected silence. They expected death. Instead, they found a hand reaching out from the grave. This is not just a story about a shipwreck. It is the forgotten, terrifying, and almost biblical account of Harrison Okene, the man who lived for 60 hours inside a tiny underwater bubble, fighting freezing cold, crushing pressure, and the madness of absolute isolation, while the world above declared him dead. So turn off the lights, settle deep into your chair, and let's descend into the abyss to uncover the miracle that physics says should never have happened. Welcome to the true story of the man who refused to die. The ocean does not bargain, it does not sign contracts, and it does not care about the schedules of oil companies or the desperate needs of the men who work the rigs. It is an ancient, indifferent thing, a vast, heavy blanket that covers 70% of the world, hiding a darkness that the human mind is not built to comprehend. We look at the surface, at the whitecaps and the rolling blue, and we see a landscape. But it is not a landscape. It is a ceiling. Beneath it lies a world where gravity behaves differently, where light is a trespasser, and where the pressure is always waiting to crush the lungs of anything that dares to breathe air. To work at sea is to enter a negotiation with this force. You build a shell of steel. You weld it tight, you fill it with engines and radar and watertight doors. You create a tiny, floating bubble of civilization, a place of hot coffee, fluorescent lights and payroll ledgers, and you drift it out into the void. You trust the machine, you trust the welds, you trust that the physics of buoyancy will hold true for just one more day, one more shift, one more sunrise. But sometimes the ocean decides to collect a debt. Sometimes the math fails, and when the steel shell cracks, the transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead does not take hours, it takes seconds. On the morning of May 26, 2013, the tugboat Jascon 4 was floating in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 19 miles off the coast of Escravos, Nigeria. It was a Sunday. The time was just past 4:30 in the morning. The sky was still dark, that deep, bruised purple that hangs over the Niger Delta before the sun burns through the humidity. The sea was restless. The Jascon 4 was not a glamorous vessel. It was a workhorse, a 100-foot wedge of industrial utility painted in high-visibility orange and white, stained with the rust and grease of heavy labor. It was a tension-leg tug, designed to tow massive oil tankers and maneuver rigs into position. It was built for power, not comfort. It was a creature of the oil industry, a small cog in a multi-billion-dollar machine that extracts the black blood of the earth to power the cities of the surface. Inside this steel hull, 12 men were sleeping or waking or working. They were the invisible workforce of the global economy. They were engineers, deckhands, captains, and cadets. They were men from Nigeria and Ukraine, brought together by the universal language of maritime labor. They lived on a rotation of weeks on and weeks off, trading huge chunks of their lives for the kind of paycheck that could build a house or send a child to a better school. Offshore work is heavy with this specific kind of gravity, the weight of families back on land, waiting for the wire transfer, waiting for the father to return. The ship was part of a convoy, towing an oil tanker into position at a loading buoy. It was a routine operation, the kind these men had performed 100 times. The engines thrummed with a steady, reassuring vibration that traveled through the metal floors and into the soles of their feet. It is a sound sailors sleep to, a heartbeat that says the machine is alive and functional. But there was a problem, a small problem at first. a detail that would later be noted in inquiry reports and safety reviews buried in the paperwork of disaster. The Gascon 4 was listing. It was leaning slightly to one side. In the maritime world, a list is a whisper of danger. It means the center of gravity is off. It means the fuel tanks might be unbalanced, or the ballast water is shifting, or the tension from the tow line is pulling the hull down at an awkward angle. On this morning, the tension on the tow line was immense. The tug was fighting the weight of the tanker and the resistance of the sea. The list was logged, but it was lived with. It was just another quirk of a hard job. The crew trusted the ship. They trusted the routine. They believed that the sun would rise, the job would finish, and they would go to breakfast. They did not know that they were already floating in a graveyard. They did not know that the physics of their survival had already begun to unravel, thread by thread. Down below, deep in the belly of the ship, the day had already begun for one man. His name was Harrison Okene. He was 29 years old. He was not a captain. He was not an engineer who understood the hydrostatics of hull displacement. He was the cook. In the hierarchy of an offshore vessel, the cook is a unique figure. He is essential yet apart. The engineers keep the heart of the ship beating. The captain steers the mind of the ship, but the cook fuels the bodies. Harrison was a man of warmth in a cold environment. His domain was the galley, a small stainless steel kingdom of pots, pans, and sacks of rice. While the deckhands dealt with salt spray and rusted chains, Harrison dealt with spices and hot oil. He had woken up early, as cooks always do. At 4:50 in the morning, while most of the crew was still tucked into their bunks, dreaming of land, Harrison was in the bathroom. He had just used the toilet. He was washing his hands, perhaps splashing water on his face to shake off the sleep. He was thinking about the menu. He was thinking about the eggs he needed to fry, the bread he needed to bake. He was wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. It is a detail that seems trivial, but in the story of survival, the smallest things become monuments. He was vulnerable, exposed, unprepared for war. He was a man in his underwear, in the safest room of the safest structure, in the middle of a routine shift. The bathroom was small, a functional cubicle of white laminate and ceramic. It was located on the lower deck below the waterline. To work in the galley or the lower cabins is to work inside a windowless steel box. You do not see the horizon. You do not see the weather. You only feel the roll of the ship. You rely on the sensation of the floor to tell you what the ocean is doing. Harrison felt the ship roll. That was normal. The Atlantic is rarely still, but then the roll didn't stop. It didn't correct itself. Usually a ship rolls with the waves. It leans, and then the buoyancy pushes it back up. It's a rhythmic dance. Lean, return, lean, return. But this time the Gascon 4 leaned and kept leaning. The floor tilted under Harrison's feet. The angle became steep, then steeper. He paused. The water in the sink would have sloshed violently to the side. The soap would have slid off the basin. In that split second, the human brain tries to rationalize the abnormal. Is it a sharp turn? Is it a heavy wave? But the vibration of the ship changed. The steady thrum of the engines was interrupted by a groan, the sound of steel under torture. Objects began to slide. In the galley, pots would be crashing to the floor. In the cabins, sleeping men were being rolled out of their bunks, waking up into a nightmare of disorientation. Harrison reached for the door handle. The handle is a standard lever, designed to be easy to open. But when a ship tilts past a certain degree, doors become heavy. Gravity, once a constant, becomes an enemy. The wall becomes the floor. The floor becomes a slide. He didn't know it yet, but outside the ocean had turned violent. A sudden ocean swell, a rogue pulse of energy traveling through the water, had hit the Gascon 4 at the worst possible moment. The tug was in a tight turn, the tow line pulled taut like a bowstring. The swell hit the beam, the side of the ship. The combination of the tow line's tension and the wave's impact acted like a giant hand flipping a toy boat. The tipping point is a terrifying concept in physics. It is the moment when stability is lost, when the forces keeping you upright are overwhelmed by the forces pulling you down. The Gascon 4 passed its tipping point in a heartbeat. The lights flickered. Once, twice. Then, the world turned upside down. It happened in 90 seconds. From the moment the first heavy roll began to the moment the ship was completely inverted, less than 2 minutes passed. Try to count 90 seconds in your head. It is enough time to tie your shoes. It is enough time to send a text message. It is not enough time to realize you are dying. For the men in the locked cabins, there was no chance. The ship capsized so fast that the corridors became vertical shafts. The doors, heavy steel fire doors, slammed shut or jammed. The furniture, desks, lockers, chairs became deadly projectiles, falling across the rooms, crushing anything in their path. And then came the water. When a ship capsizes, it doesn't just sink, it inhales. As the hull flips, the ocean rushes in through every vent, every porthole, every open hatch. It is a violence of rushing liquid, a roar that drowns out the screams of men and the tearing of metal. The water is cold, heavy, and unrelenting. Harrison Okene was thrown across the small bathroom. The sudden inversion meant he no longer knew which way was up. Was the door above him? Below him? The lights died, plunging him into absolute suffocating darkness. Panic is a biological alarm. It floods the system with adrenaline, urging the body to fight or flee. But in the dark, inside a capsizing ship, panic is a death sentence. It makes you thrash. It makes you gasp. And if you gasp when the water hits you, you drown. Harrison scrambled. He found the door. He managed to force it open, stepping out not into a hallway, but into a chaotic funnel of rushing water. The ocean was entering the ship with the force of a fire hose. He was swept up, or was it down, along the corridor. He was screaming, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the death throes of the Gascon 4. He was being battered against the walls, his body scraping against pipes and valves. He was naked, vulnerable, a soft piece of flesh inside a grinding steel mixer. He needed to find a way out. His instinct screamed for the surface. But where was the surface? In a capsized ship, up leads to the bottom of the ocean. Down leads to the hull, which is now the ceiling. The geometry of survival had been reversed. He bumped into other bodies. He heard the terrifying, choked sounds of his crewmates. He saw glimpses of them in the flashes of emergency lighting that sparked and died. Terrified faces, flailing limbs, men trapped in cabins that were filling with water like aquariums. He saw 3 men swept past him. He tried to reach out, but the current was too strong. They were gone in an instant, pulled into the abyss of the sinking stern. Harrison was alone. He was fighting the water, fighting the debris, fighting the darkness. He was swept into a different cabin, an officer's cabin. He grabbed onto something solid, a handle, a floating mattress, anything. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the water and into his bones. It was hitting the seabed. The Gascon 4 had sunk 30 meters, nearly 100 feet, to the bottom of the Atlantic. It landed upside down, its mast and bridge crushed into the silt, its keel pointing toward the sky it would never see again. The violence of the movement stopped. The rushing water slowed. The ship settled. And then, silence. A silence so heavy, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight. The roar of the ocean was gone, the hum of the engines was gone. The voices of the 11 other men were gone. Harrison was in the dark. The water was up to his chest. He was shivering. He was breathing. Wait, he was breathing. He reached up. His hand broke the surface of the water and hit cold steel. He wasn't underwater. He was in a bubble. This is a phenomenon of physics that seems like a miracle, but is simply a matter of displacement. When the ship flipped, it didn't fill completely. Like an overturned bucket pushed into a bathtub, the hull trapped a pocket of air. The water pushed in from the bottom, compressing the air, squeezing it tight against the steel ceiling, but it could not displace it entirely. Harrison had stumbled into one of these pockets. He was in the officer's toilet, a small compartment adjacent to a cabin. The room was 4 feet square. The air pocket was perhaps 4 feet high. He was alive, but he was buried alive. He was standing in water that was freezing cold. He was wearing only his underwear. He was in total darkness, and he was 30 meters under the surface of the sea. The reality of his situation began to set in, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, creeping horror. He was inside a tomb. The air he was breathing was finite. The water he was standing in was rising, or at least it felt like it was. The pressure was immense. At 30 meters, the pressure is 4 times that of the surface. His ears popped and ached. The nitrogen in the air he breathed was being forced into his bloodstream at a dangerous rate. He called out, "Hello?" His voice sounded strange. The pressurized air changed the pitch, making it sound thin and reedy. "Is anyone there?" Silence. No, not silence. Sounds began to emerge from the wreck, the groaning of the steel as the ship settled deeper into the mud, the creaking of bulkheads struggling against the water pressure, and then softer sounds, the lapping of water against the walls of his tiny prison. Harrison Okene was a religious man. He was a man who knew the Psalms. In the darkness, with the water chilling his blood, he began to pray. It was not a prayer of hope initially, it was a prayer of terror. He assumed he was the last man left alive. He assumed the water would rise and fill the final few feet of space, and he would take his last breath in the dark, alone. He tried to move. He felt around the small space. He found a floating mattress. He pulled it towards him. It was sodden, heavy, but it was something to hold on to. He tried to climb onto it to get his body out of the freezing water, but there wasn't enough headroom. He had to stay submerged, waist-deep, chest-deep. He waited. Time in the dark does not move in minutes or hours. It moves in heartbeats. It moves in breaths. Harrison didn't know how much air he had. He didn't know if anyone knew the ship had gone down. He didn't know if a rescue mission was even possible. The offshore industry has protocols for everything. There are manuals for fire, manuals for spills, manuals for man overboard. But there is no manual for a man trapped in an air bubble at the bottom of the sea for days. It is a scenario that is written off as impossible. The survival rates for a sudden capsize are statistically 0. The cold kills you. The lack of air kills you. The panic kills you. But Harrison did not die. He stood there, shivering, listening to the tomb he was trapped in. He began to think about his wife. He began to think about the life he had left behind on the surface. It felt like a different planet, a different timeline. Down here there was only the cold, the salt, and the smell. The smell was changing. It was the smell of diesel fuel leaking from the tanks, mixing with the brine, and beneath that, a fainter, more terrible smell. The scent of death. The bodies of his colleagues were somewhere nearby, drifting in the corridors of the sunken ship. He was sharing his grave with them. The cold began to gnaw at his muscles. Hypothermia is a slow assassin. It starts with shivering, violent and uncontrollable. Then it moves to confusion. The blood retreats from the extremities to protect the organs. The hands go numb, the feet go numb, the mind begins to drift. Harrison knew he had to stay awake. If he fell asleep, he might slip under the water and never wake up. He had to fight the urge to close his eyes. He had to fight the cold. He remembered the tools of his trade. He was a cook. He was used to solving problems with his hands. He felt around the debris in the water. He found a piece of wood, perhaps a shelf that had broken off. He wedged it between the walls to create a small perch, something to rest his arms on, to keep his head above the black water. He created a routine. Pray, listen, adjust position, pray, listen. Every sound from the outside world was magnified. A thud on the hull. Was that a rescue boat? Or just the ship shifting in the current? A creak of metal. Was the hull collapsing? He didn't know that on the surface the chaos was different but just as intense. The disappearance of the Jascon 4 had been noticed. The tow line had snapped. The tug had vanished from the radar. Mayday calls were going out. Ships were turning around. Helicopters were scrambling, but they were looking for debris. They were looking for oil slicks. They were looking for bodies floating in life jackets. They were not looking for a man alive inside the wreck. The official assumption, the logical, bureaucratic assumption, was that all hands were lost. The water temperature, the depth, the speed of the sinking, the math was clear. No one survives a drop to the seabed inside a steel coffin. Harrison was a statistical anomaly. He was a ghost in the system. As the hours dragged on, the air in his pocket began to stale. Carbon dioxide was building up. Every breath he exhaled was poisoning the small amount of oxygen he had left. CO2 toxicity is a strange way to die. It causes headaches. It causes panic. It causes hallucinations. Harrison began to see things in the dark. shapes moving in the water, flashes of light that weren't there. He heard voices. Were they the voices of his crewmates? Were they calling him to join them? He fought the madness with the only weapon he had, his voice. He began to recite the scriptures aloud. "O God, by your name, save me. Judge me by your strength." The words bounced off the steel walls, hollow and strange. He was thirsty. The salt water was all around him, a cruel irony. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. He was dehydrated, shivering and breathing poison. He remembered that he had been making breakfast. He wondered if the eggs were still in the carton, somewhere floating in the galley. He wondered if the bread had dissolved. It was a ridiculous thought, but the mind clings to the mundane to keep the horror at bay. He was a cook who had been preparing to feed 11 men. Now he was the only thing left that was not food for the ocean. Sometime in the darkness he felt a change in the water pressure. A small shift. The tide was turning above. The ocean breathes in tides, inhaling and exhaling the coastline. Even down here, at 30 meters, the pull of the moon was felt. Harrison Okene waited. He did not know it, but he was about to endure a test of endurance that rivals the greatest survival stories of history. Shackleton on the ice, Ralston in the canyon, Okene in the dark. But unlike those men, he could not move, he could not walk out, he could not climb. He had to wait. He had to wait for a world that had already written him off to come back and check the ledger. He was alone in the belly of the beast, and the beast was digesting him slowly, 1 degree of body temperature at a time. The first day passed. The sun rose and set on the surface, but Harrison saw no light. The second day began. The silence continued. And then he heard something new. It wasn't the groan of the ship. It wasn't the lap of the water. It was a hammer. Clang, clang, clang. A rhythmic, metallic sound. Someone was hitting the hull. Harrison's heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't alone. But were they rescue divers, or were they salvage divers come to cut the ship apart for scrap? He took a deep breath of the foul air, plunged his hand into the water, and found a piece of pipe. He struck the steel wall of his prison. Clang, clang, clang. He waited. Silence. Had they heard him? Or was the ocean playing tricks again? He hit it again, harder, desperately. "I am here," he screamed, though the water swallowed the words. "I am here." No answer. The hammering on the outside stopped. The ship fell silent again. Harrison lowered the pipe. The hope that had flared up in his chest turned into a cold, hard lump of despair. They hadn't heard him. They were leaving. He was going to die here. This is the end of the beginning, the moment where the adrenaline fades and the long, slow attrition of the spirit begins. The grand ambition of the oil industry, the millions of dollars of equipment, the complex logistics, it all comes down to one man, shivering in his underwear, holding a piece of pipe, waiting for a signal that might never come again. The ledger was closed. The Gascon 4 was a wreck. The crew was dead. But Harrison Okene was still refusing to sign his name to the casualty list. The silence that followed the hammering was worse than the noise of the sinking. When the ship had gone down, it was a cacophony of violence, screaming metal, rushing water, the physical destruction of a home. But now the silence was heavy, thick, and intentional. It was the silence of a door being locked. Harrison Okene lowered the piece of pipe. His hand was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the sudden, crushing exhaustion of adrenaline leaving the body. He had signaled. The world had not answered. The conclusion was logical, cold, and inescapable. They did not know he was there. Or perhaps worse, they knew the ship was there, but they did not care about the air pocket. They were looking for a wreck, not a survivor. The ship groaned. It was a deep, mournful sound vibrating through the steel walls and into the water, pressing against Harrison's chest. The Gascon 4 was settling. The seabed off the coast of Nigeria is soft, a landscape of silt and mud. The heavy tug, upside down and full of water, was slowly sinking into the earth. It was digging its own grave. Every time the metal creaked, Harrison froze. In the pitch blackness, sound becomes sight. A creak means movement. Movement means the air pocket might shift. If the ship tilted just a few degrees, the bubble of oxygen that was keeping him alive could simply slide out, escaping through a broken window or a hatch, bubbling up to the surface to pop in the sunlight, leaving him to drown in the dark. He was terrified of the water. He was terrified of the steel. But mostly he was terrified of what he could hear moving in the water with him. It started as a faint scratching, then a splash. Something small, something quick. Fish. The ocean had already begun to claim the Gascon 4. Small fish, drawn by the smell of debris, by the scent of the galley stores, had swum into the wreck. They were navigating the corridors that used to be Harrison's workplace. They were brushing against his legs in the water. It is a primal horror. To be alive, conscious, and breathing, while the scavengers of the deep begin to explore your tomb. He kicked out, splashing the water, screaming at them to get away. The splashing echoed in the small steel chamber, loud and frantic. But the fish returned. They had no concept of the line between the living and the dead. To them, Harrison was just another part of the reef. He realized he could not stay in the water. The cold was stealing his heat, calorie by calorie. The physics of heat transfer are cruel. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. If he stayed submerged up to his chest, his heart would stop long before his air ran out. He needed to build an island. In the absolute darkness, he began to engineer his survival. He reached out with numb fingers, cataloguing the debris floating around him. A mattress, a wooden panel, some tools. He was in the officer's cabin, a small space turned upside down. The ceiling was the floor. The floor was the ceiling. He found a second mattress floating in the adjacent space. It took an immense effort to move them. His muscles were stiff, his movements sluggish. He had to drag the sodden, waterlogged mattresses and stack them on top of a floating wooden shelf, wedging the whole unstable structure between the wall and a steel pipe. It was a platform, a raft. He climbed up. It was precarious. It wobbled with every breath, but it lifted his torso out of the water. He was still wet, still freezing, but he was no longer submerged. He curled his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs, trying to trap whatever warmth his body was still generating. He was a battery, and he was running low. Hunger is a sharp pain, but thirst is a dull, expansive ache that takes over the entire mind. Harrison had been in the air pocket for over 24 hours. He had swallowed salt water during the capsize, which only accelerated the dehydration. His tongue felt like sandpaper. His throat was a dry canyon. He knew there were supplies. He was the cook. He knew the inventory of the Gascon 4 better than anyone. He knew there were cans of sardines, loaves of bread, cartons of juice. But they were in the galley or the storeroom. To get there, he would have to leave his air pocket. He would have to take a breath, dive down into the black water, swim through the inverted labyrinth of the ship, find the supplies in the dark, and swim back before his lungs burst. It was a suicide mission. He couldn't do it. But the thirst was a voice that wouldn't stop talking. It whispered to him in the dark. There is water. There is drink. Just a few feet away. He remembered the layout of the cabin he was in. Officers often kept personal stashes, a bottle of water, a can of soda. He reached down from his platform, sweeping his hand through the oily water below him. Debris bumped against his fingers. A shoe, a book, and then the cold, smooth aluminum of a can. He pulled it up. He traced the shape with his thumb. The tab, the rim. It was a can of Coca-Cola. He found another, and another. It seems absurd. A man trapped on the bottom of the ocean, surviving on the most ubiquitous symbol of modern consumerism. But in that moment, the sound of the tab cracking open, psh, was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of normalcy. He drank. The liquid was cold. The sugar hit his bloodstream like a drug. The caffeine, a stimulant, sharpened his fading senses. For a moment the fog of hypothermia lifted. He wasn't just a dying animal anymore. He was Harrison Okene, a man who liked a cold drink. He found a can of sardines as well. He ate them in the dark, licking the oil from his fingers. It was a small victory, but survival is just a series of small victories stacked on top of inevitable defeat. The Coke gave him energy, but it couldn't give him heat, it couldn't give him air. And the air was changing. We take the atmosphere for granted. We breathe in, we breathe out. and the wind carries our exhaust away. But in a sealed steel box there is no wind. Harrison was breathing the same air over and over again. He was consuming the oxygen, turning it into carbon dioxide. As the oxygen levels dropped and the CO2 levels rose, the chemistry of his blood began to shift. High levels of carbon dioxide are narcotic. They dull the mind. They create a sense of detachment, a strange, floaty feeling that masks the danger. He began to hallucinate. It wasn't a sudden break from reality. It was a slow dissolving of the boundaries. In the pitch black, his eyes strained to find light, so his brain invented it. He saw flashes of color, green neon swirls, sparks of red. He saw shapes standing in the corner of the cabin. He wasn't alone anymore. The ghosts had arrived. He began to talk to them. He spoke to his colleagues. He asked the captain why they had turned so sharp. He asked the engineer if the lights were coming back on. In his mind, they were there with him, sitting on the other side of the cabin, waiting for the shift to end. He heard their voices. They weren't screaming anymore. They were calm. They were telling him to rest. They were telling him it was okay to sleep. Sleep, the darkness whispered. Just close your eyes. It's warm in the dream. This was the deadliest trap of all. If he fell asleep, he would slide off his precarious raft. He would slip under the water. He would not wake up. He fought the voices. He shouted at them. "I am alive," he yelled. "I am not dead yet." He recited the Psalms louder. He used the noise of his own voice to drive back the hallucinations. He forced his brain to focus on the concrete reality of his situation, the cold metal against his back, the smell of the diesel fumes, the taste of the salt. While Harrison fought his war in the dark, a different kind of calculation was happening 60 meters above his head. On the surface, the sun was shining. The Atlantic was calm, masking the violence of the day before. Ships had gathered around the site where the Gascon 4 had disappeared. A dive support vessel, the Okene, had arrived. This was a massive ship, a floating city of technology designed for one thing: deep-sea intervention. It had cranes, remote-operated vehicles, and a saturation diving system. Saturation diving is the pinnacle of human underwater capability. It is the only way to work at these depths for long periods. The divers do not just put on a tank and jump in. They live in a pressurized chamber on the deck of the ship, breathing a mixture of helium and oxygen. Their bodies are saturated with gas at the same pressure as the sea floor. They are transported to the depths in a diving bell, an elevator for the abyss. But the men on the Okene were not preparing for a rescue mission. They were preparing for a recovery mission. In the boardrooms where these decisions are made, the math is simple. The water temperature was roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit, warm for the ocean, but deadly for a human submerged for more than a few hours. The ship had been down for 2 days. The air pockets would be toxic or compressed to nothing. The insurance companies needed proof of death. The families needed bodies to bury. The oil company needed the channel cleared. So the order was given: go down, survey the wreck, recover the bodies, do it safely, do it efficiently. There was no urgency in the briefing room. The divers studied the blueprints of the Gascon 4. They memorized the layout, the bridge, the cabins, the galley. They planned their route. They discussed the hazards: sharp metal, floating debris, the risk of getting their umbilicals snagged. They did not discuss the possibility of finding anyone alive. It wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't a variable in the equation. To the experts, to the seasoned professionals who knew the sea better than anyone, the Gascon 4 was a tomb. You do not knock on the door of a tomb and expect an answer. Back in the dark, Harrison had lost track of time. Was it day? Was it night? The rhythm of the world had vanished. His skin was beginning to peel. The salt water was dissolving the outer layers of his epidermis. His tongue was swollen. His eyes burned from the diesel fumes trapped in the air pocket. The CO2 was making him groggy, stripping away his fear and replacing it with a heavy, leaden resignation. He stopped shivering. This is a bad sign. It means the body has given up trying to generate heat. He thought about death. He had always feared it, as all men do. But now that it was sitting beside him on the mattress, it didn't seem so terrible. It seemed like a release. It seemed like an end to the cold. He thought about his wife, Okene. They hadn't been married long. He thought about the last time he saw her. He tried to conjure her face in the dark, but it was blurry. The hallucinations were interfering. He began to bargain with God. It is the final stage of grief and the final refuge of the survivor. "God," he whispered, his voice raspy and broken, "if you get me out of here, I will never go back to the sea. I will serve you. Just let me see the sky one more time." He waited for an answer, but God was silent. The only sound was the lap of the water against the steel. He felt a deep, overwhelming sadness, not for himself, but for the anonymity of his end. To die in the dark, alone, without anyone knowing the hour or the minute, to simply vanish. He prepared himself. He adjusted his position on the mattress. He clasped his hands together. He decided that when the water finally rose high enough, or when the air finally turned to poison, he would not fight. He would let it take him. He closed his eyes. He let the darkness enter him, and then he heard it. A sound, not the groan of the ship, not the splash of a fish, a hum, a mechanical hum. It was distant at first, vibrating through the water. It grew louder. It was the sound of a thruster, a propeller. Harrison's eyes snapped open. He held his breath. Then, a noise that was unmistakable. A metallic clank, heavy boots on steel. Someone was walking on the hull of the ship. It wasn't a hallucination. The sound was too sharp, too physical. He scrambled up. He grabbed the piece of pipe again, but he was weak. His arms felt like they were made of wet sand. He struck the Walsian clang. He waited. Clang. A response or just an echo. He heard a noise that sounded like a saw. A grinding, tearing sound. They were cutting into the ship. No, that didn't make sense. Then he saw it. It was faint at first, a shifting of the shadows in the water below him, a glow, not the neon swirls of his madness, but a true pale light. It was diffusing through the murky water, casting long, swinging shadows of debris against the walls. It was a flashlight. Harrison stared at it, paralyzed. The light was coming from the corridor. It was moving. It was sweeping back and forth, searching. He tried to scream, but his voice was a croak. He realized with a jolt of terror that the diver might not come to this cabin. The diver might turn around. The diver might leave. He had to get to the water. He slid off his mattress. The cold water hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of him. He flailed. He reached down into the darkness, towards the glow. The light was getting brighter. It was turning the black water into a ghostly green. Harrison saw the source. It was a beam of pure white light, cutting through the silt. And behind it a figure. It looked like an alien. A massive bulbous helmet. A suit of thick rubber. Umbilical cords trailing behind it like the tails of a strange sea creature. The figure was moving slowly, methodically. It was looking at the floor. It was looking for bodies. Harrison was floating near the ceiling of the adjacent cabin. The diver was below him, moving past. The diver didn't look up. Why would he? Gravity pulls the dead down. The diver was scanning the deck plates. Harrison realized he was invisible. He was a shadow above the light. He had to do something. He had to touch the angel before it flew away. He pushed himself down. The buoyancy of the air in his lungs fought him. He reached out with his hand, his black hand, pale from the cold, trembling. The diver was just inches away. Harrison stretched. His fingers brushed the smooth, rubberized shoulder of the diver's suit. The reaction was instantaneous. The diver flinched, a violent, full-body shudder. He spun around, the light swinging wildly. Imagine the diver's perspective. You are 60 meters deep in a sunken tomb. You are surrounded by death. You are breathing helium. The world is dark and hostile. You expect cold steel and cold flesh. And then something grabs you, a hand. For a second, the diver froze. The light fell on Harrison's hand. And then the hand moved. It waved. The diver's voice crackled over the comms system, audible even through the water, distorted by the helium, but clear in its terror and disbelief. "He's alive! He's alive!" The words echoed through the wreck. They traveled up the umbilical cord, 60 meters to the surface, into the control room of the Okene, where men in headsets sat watching video screens. On the screen, a ghostly hand was waving in front of the camera. The supervisor on the surface, a man of iron discipline, stared at the monitor. He keyed his microphone. "What do you mean he's alive?" "There's a hand," the diver shouted. "It's moving!" In the dark cabin, Harrison Okene pulled his hand back. He saw the diver's helmet tilt up. He saw the face behind the glass, eyes wide, filled with shock. Harrison didn't know the diver's name. He didn't know the language he spoke. But he saw the light, and for the first time in 60 hours the darkness retreated. He was found. But being found is not the same as being saved. Harrison was deep underwater, his body saturated with nitrogen, his lungs fragile, his mind on the brink of collapse. He was a biological time bomb. If they brought him up now, the pressure change would kill him instantly. His blood would boil. He would die in agony before he broke the surface. The diver reached out. A gloved hand took Harrison's hand. It was a handshake across the barrier of worlds. The living reaching into the land of the dead. The diver squeezed. Harrison squeezed back. It was the strongest grip he had ever felt. The diver gave him a thumbs up. It is the universal sign of the diver. "Are you okay?" Harrison didn't know the sign. He just stared. The diver gestured again. "Calm down. Stay there." Then the diver turned his head, speaking into his helmet. "I have a survivor." Repeat, "I have a survivor." On the surface, the control room erupted. Coffee cups were set down. Chairs were spun around. The recovery mission was over. The rescue mission had just begun. And it was going to be the most complex, dangerous, and impossible rescue in the history of the oil fields. Harrison watched the diver. He watched the bubbles rising from the regulator. He watched the light. He didn't know how they would get him out. He didn't care. He just knew that he wasn't alone anymore. The machine had finally noticed the man. The hand that grasped the diver was not just a hand. It was a violation of the rules of the sea. In the cold calculus of deep-sea recovery, there are objects and there are operators. The operators are alive, encased in technology. The objects are dead, drifting in the silt. When the object reached out and touched the operator, the universe of the Jascon 4 fractured. The diver, a man named Nico, recoiled. It was a reflex, a spasm of primal fear. But training overrides fear. He stared into the darkness of the cabin, his helmet lights cutting a cone through the particulate matter. He saw the pale skin. He saw the eyes. Harrison Okene was blinking in the glare. He was a creature emerging from a myth, a man who had been swallowed by a whale and refused to be digested. But he was fragile. He was terrifyingly fragile. The communication loop between the diver and the surface control room became a lifeline of frantic, disciplined data. "He is alive," Nico said again. "He is conscious." The supervisor's voice came down from the ship, sharp and urgent. "Keep him calm. Do not let him move. Do not let him panic." Panic kills underwater. It is the great accelerator. If Harrison panicked, his heart rate would spike. He would consume more oxygen. He would inhale water. But more dangerously, if he tried to bolt for the surface, if the instinct to flee the tomb took over, the physics would tear him apart. The nitrogen dissolved in his blood under the immense pressure of 30 meters would bubble out like a shaken soda can. It would block his arteries, shred his tissues, and stop his heart before he even saw the sun. Harrison didn't move. He was too weak, too stunned. He looked at the alien figure floating before him. He saw the diver reach for something on his belt. A weapon? No, a bottle of water. Nico unscrewed the cap and held it out. It was a gesture of such profound humanity that it bridged the gap between the two worlds instantly. Here in the most hostile environment on Earth, one man was offering another a drink. Harrison took it. He drank. It was fresh water. It washed away the taste of salt and diesel and death. Then the diver spoke to him. But the voice that came out of the helmet's external speaker was not the voice of a hero. It was high-pitched, squeaky, cartoonish. "How are you?" the diver asked. Harrison stared. He couldn't understand. The air the divers breathe is a mixture of helium and oxygen. Helium is lighter than air. It passes over the vocal cords faster, distorting the sound waves. It is the Donald Duck effect. In a movie, it is funny. In a shipwreck, 30 meters down, it is surreal. It sounded like a hallucination. Harrison strained to listen. The diver gestured. Thumbs up. Good. Thumbs down. Bad? Harrison gave a weak thumbs up. He was alive. That was the only metric that mattered. But the environment was still killing him. The water in the cabin was cold, and Harrison was naked but for his underwear. His body temperature was dangerously low. The diver, Nico, was wearing a hot water suit, a suit constantly flushed with warm water pumped from the surface. He was a walking radiator. Harrison was a dying ember. Nico moved closer. He did something extraordinary. He poured the warm water from his own supply over Harrison's shivering shoulders. The heat hit Harrison like a physical shock. It was the first warmth he had felt in 3 days. It was the feeling of life returning. Now began the logistics of the impossible. They had to move a man who had no diving gear, no training and no strength, through a capsized, debris-filled labyrinth in pitch darkness, sent to a diving bell that was parked some distance away. They couldn't just swim him out. He couldn't hold his breath that long. They needed to turn Harrison Okene into a diver. Nico called for support. Another diver arrived, carrying a spare helmet. It was a KMB band mask, a heavy rubberized hood that seals around the face and provides a continuous flow of gas. They explained it to him with gestures. "Put this on. Breathe." Harrison nodded. He was past fear. He was in a state of obedient trance. He trusted the alien. They placed the mask over his head. It was claustrophobic, tight, and smelled of rubber. They strapped it down. Then, the hiss of gas. Oxygen. Harrison inhaled. For 60 hours, he had been breathing recycled, poisoned air, thick with carbon dioxide and fumes. Now, a stream of clean, cool helium-oxygen mix flooded his lungs. It was like drinking pure energy. His head cleared. The fog of the CO2 narcosis began to lift, replaced by the sharp, crystalline focus of the gas mix. But the helmet was heavy, and Harrison was weak. "We have to move," the helium voice squeaked. They guided him into the water. Harrison left his air pocket. He left the mattress, the hammer, the empty Coke cans. He slipped into the black water that he had feared for 3 days. But he wasn't swimming. He was being carried. The divers bracketed him. They held onto his harness. They became his propulsion. The journey through the ship was a nightmare tour of his former life. They floated down corridors that were now shafts. They passed doorways that led to rooms filled with water. The divers' lights swept over the wreckage, floating boots, papers, tools. Harrison closed his eyes. He didn't want to see. He didn't want to see the faces of the others. He just wanted to be out. They reached the exit point. A hole in the steel. A hatch. It didn't matter. They passed through the skin of the ship and into the open ocean. The shock of the open water was immense. There were no walls, just the vast crushing dark of the Atlantic, and hanging there, suspended by thick cables from the world above, was the diving bell. It looked like a small spaceship, round, white, glowing with internal light. It was the elevator. They pushed Harrison toward it. The bottom of the bell was open, the moon pool. The water pressure kept the air inside from escaping, just like in Harrison's air pocket. But inside this bubble, there was light, warmth, and voices. Harrison popped his head up through the moon pool. Hands reached down, strong hands. They grabbed his harness and hauled him up out of the water. He collapsed onto the metal floor of the diving bell. The mask was pulled off. He gasped, taking in the air of the bell. It was warm. It smelled of men and machinery. He looked up. There were faces. Divers. They were looking at him as if he were a ghost. They were stripping off his wet clothes, wrapping him in blankets, putting a foil hat on his head to keep the heat in. "I am hungry," Harrison said. The divers laughed. It was a nervous, relieved laughter. They gave him water. They checked his vitals. But the journey wasn't over. In fact, the most dangerous part had just begun. Harrison Okene was now a saturated diver. His body had soaked up the inert gases of the deep. He was pressurized to the equivalent of 30 meters of water. If they brought the bell to the surface and opened the door, he would die. He was a prisoner of physics. The bell began to rise. Harrison felt the movement, a gentle sway. He was leaving the Jascon 4 behind. He was leaving his friends behind. The guilt began to mix with the relief, a toxic cocktail that would sit in his stomach for years. The ascent took time, but not enough time to decompress. The bell was hoisted up through the water column, breaking the surface of the Atlantic, and lifted onto the deck of the Okene. But the door didn't open to the sunlight. The bell was mated, clamped tight, to a system of deck decompression chambers. These are long steel cylinders, essentially living quarters for the divers. They are kept at the same pressure as the bottom of the sea. Harrison crawled from the bell into the chamber. He was safe from the ocean, but he was not back in the world. He was in a steel tube, sitting on a bunk, surrounded by dials and gauges. The supervisor's voice came over the intercom. "Harrison, you are safe, but you cannot leave yet. We have to bring you up slowly." "How long?" Harrison asked. "Days," the voice said. Days. He had survived 3 days in a shipwreck. Now he had to survive nearly 3 more days in a box. The decompression process is a slow mathematical reduction of pressure. The engineers on the outside lower the pressure in the chamber by tiny increments, allowing the gas in the body to dissolve and be exhaled naturally. If they rush it, the bends strike. Joint pain, paralysis, death. So, Harrison waited. He sat in the chamber with the divers who had saved him. They were strangers, white men from different countries, professionals of the deep. He was a Nigerian cook, but in that chamber the hierarchy of the world was dissolved. They were just men who had cheated the sea. They watched him. They monitored his breathing. They fed him. Harrison slept. For the first time in 60 hours he slept without the fear of water rising up his nose. He slept a deep, comatose sleep, his body shutting down to repair the damage of the cold and the stress. When he woke, the walls were still there. The hiss of the gas was still there. He looked out of the small viewport. He could see the deck of the ship. He could see people walking around in the sunshine. He could see the sky. It was right there, just inches away, separated by a layer of thick glass and a pressure differential that would kill him. It is a specific kind of torture, to see the world but be unable to touch it, to be a specimen in a jar. The time passed in a blur. He ate rice, he drank juice, he spoke to the divers. They told him about the rescue. They told him that they hadn't believed he was real. They told him that when the hand appeared, they thought it was a corpse moving in the current. Harrison listened, but he was detached. His mind was still back in the dark cabin. He could still hear the water lapping. He could still hear the prayers he had whispered. He wondered why he had been chosen. Why him? Why not the captain? Why not the cadets? He was just the cook. He wasn't important. This is the survivor's burden. The question that has no answer. The math of the ocean is random. The list of the ship, the location of the air pocket, the durability of the human spirit. It was a lottery, and he held the only winning ticket. Finally, after 60 hours of decompression, almost the exact same amount of time he had spent trapped, the pressure in the chamber reached 1 atmosphere. Surface pressure. The hiss stopped. The gauges settled. The heavy steel door was unclamped. It swung open. Fresh, unrecycled, real air rushed in. It smelled of salt spray and hot metal and the ocean breeze. Harrison Okene stood up. His legs were weak. He stepped through the hatch. The light was blinding. The sun was high and fierce. He squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. The deck was crowded. Crew members, doctors, officials. They were cheering, they were clapping. They put him on a stretcher, not because he couldn't walk, but because he was precious. He was fragile cargo. He looked around. The ocean was blue and calm, stretching out to the horizon. It looked innocent. It looked beautiful. It looked like a lie. He knew what was underneath. He knew the cold and the dark and the silence. He knew that the surface was just a thin skin over a monster. They carried him to the medical bay. A helicopter was waiting to take him to the mainland, to the hospital, to the press conferences, to his wife. As the helicopter lifted off, the roar of the rotors drowning out the cheers, Harrison looked down. He saw the Okene. He saw the diving support vessels. And he saw the patch of ocean where the Jascon 4 lay. It was just water, seamless, unbroken water. The tomb was hidden perfectly. He closed his eyes and turned his face away from the window. He didn't want to look at the sea. He never wanted to look at the sea again. The crisis was over. The man was out of the machine, but the machine had left its mark on the man. The nitrogen had left his blood, but the darkness had not left his mind. Harrison Okene was the man who came back from the dead, but as he would soon discover, you cannot visit the underworld and return unchanged. The world celebrates the miracle, but the survivor has to live with the memory, and the memory is a pressure that never decompresses. The skin began to peel on the second day back on land. It came off in sheets, shedding from his hands, his feet, his back. The ocean had soaked him for so long that the outer layers of his humanity were dissolving. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the Coke can, the hands that had touched the diver, and they looked raw, new, and terrifyingly vulnerable. This is the part of the story the headlines ignore. The cameras love the rescue. They love the hug with the wife, the tearful press conference, the thumbs up from the hospital bed. They frame it as a miracle, a divine intervention, a triumph of the human spirit. But they do not stay for the night. When the cameras leave, the silence returns. And for Harrison Okene, the silence of his bedroom in Warri was louder than the silence of the seabed. He could not sleep. When he closed his eyes, the bed seemed to tilt. The floor seemed to liquefy. He would wake up gasping, his lungs burning, thrashing against the sheets, convinced that the water was rising in the room. He checked the door. He checked the window. He needed to know where the exit was. This is the psychological bends. The body decompresses in days, but the mind takes years. The trauma of confinement, of sensory deprivation, of waiting for death, does not just vanish because you are breathing air again. It rewires the brain. It sets the alarm bells to a permanent low-level hum. Harrison was a celebrity for a week. The video of his rescue went viral. Millions of people watched the grainy footage of the hand reaching out from the dark. They shared it. They commented on it. They used it as proof of God or proof of luck. But the machinery of the oil industry does not deal in miracles. It deals in liability. The Jascon 4 was a total loss. 11 men were dead. The company had to manage the fallout. There were settlements to be paid, insurance claims to be filed, reports to be written. Harrison expected, perhaps naively, that his survival would change his life. He had endured the unendurable. He had provided the industry with a data point that shouldn't exist. But when the checks were cut, the reality set in. He was a cook. He was a contract worker. In the eyes of the ledger, he was an asset that had been damaged, but salvaged. The compensation was modest. It was enough to buy a used car, perhaps fix up a house. It was not a fortune. The price of a miracle, it turns out, is subject to market rates. He was not offered a lifetime pension. He was not offered a new career on land. He was offered a payout and a handshake. The system absorbed the shock of the disaster and continued to rotate. The rigs kept drilling. The tugs kept towing. The oil kept flowing. Harrison found himself alone again. The friends he had worked with were gone, their bodies recovered and buried. He was the sole witness to their final moments, the keeper of their last screams. He carried the guilt of the survivor, the heavy, irrational feeling that by living, he had somehow stolen life from the others. Why did the air pocket form in the officer's toilet? Why not the captain's cabin? Why not the crew quarters? Physics is impartial, but grief demands a reason. In the years that followed, the story of the Jascon 4 began to fade. The industry learned from it, but quietly. Protocols were updated in the back pages of safety manuals. Proof-of-life checks became more rigorous before salvage operations began. Divers were briefed to tap on hulls, to listen for the knock of the trapped. But they didn't name the rule after him. They didn't build a monument. The offshore world is not sentimental. It buries its mistakes at sea. Harrison tried to stay away from the water. He took jobs on land. He tried to be normal. But the ocean has a gravity that is hard to escape. It is the source of the economy in the Niger Delta. To turn your back on the sea is to turn your back on the livelihood of your city. And there was something else, a compulsion, a need to understand what had happened to him. In a twist that defies the logic of trauma, Harrison Okene did not run from the water forever. He turned toward it. Years after the accident, the cook who had been trapped in the dark decided to become a diver. He trained. He learned the physics of buoyancy that had saved him. He learned about gas mixtures and decompression tables. He learned how to save others. It was a reclamation of power. He refused to be the victim of the ocean. He wanted to be the master of it. He wanted to be the one reaching the hand out, not the one waiting in the dark. It is a profound victory, but it is a quiet one. He dives today. He works on the infrastructure that crisscrosses the seabed. He descends into the green gloom, and he breathes the pressurized air, and he works. But he never forgets. Every time he descends, he knows what is waiting. He knows how thin the shell is. He knows that the line between the operator and the object is just a matter of luck. The wreck of the Jascon 4 is gone now, cleared away or broken down by the relentless appetite of the salt and the currents. The physical evidence of the miracle has eroded. The mattress he sat on, the Coke cans he drank from, the hammer he used to signal, they are all gone. But the 60 hours remain. They exist in a suspended state, a pocket of time that Harrison carries with him. When he drives past the ocean, he does not see a view. He sees a lid. He sees the ceiling of the world he lived in for 3 days. We tell this story because we want to believe in the exception. We want to believe that if we were trapped in the dark, if the walls were closing in, we would be found. We want to believe that someone is listening for our knock. But the true lesson of the Jascon 4 is not about the rescue, it is about the silence that preceded it. For 60 hours the world accepted that Harrison Okene was dead. The paperwork was ready. The search was effectively over before it began. He was saved not because the system worked, but because a diver happened to look at the wrong spot at the right time, and because a cook happened to have the strength to wave his hand one last time. It was a glitch in the probability matrix. The ocean keeps its secrets. It swallows ships and men and history, and the surface remains flat and blue and indifferent. It reflects the sky, hiding the violence below. Harrison Okene is a man who walked out of a tomb. He is a living ghost, a breathing testament to the resilience of the human animal. But he is also a warning. He reminds us that we are small. He reminds us that our machines are fallible. And he reminds us that in the end, when the lights go out and the water rises, we are all just waiting in the dark, hoping that someone, somewhere, hears us breathing. The water is deep, the silence is long, but sometimes, just sometimes, the hand reaches back,